Okay, and disembodied voices that we're recording, so we're good to start. It's my sincere pleasure today to introduce to you Nikola Rodriguez. Nikola comes to us from British Columbia, Canada, and she is a honors graduate from Hilo in marine science, and she did that in 2018. She also received the NOAA Education Partnership Program Minority Serving Institution Fellowship or Award, sorry, as well as 2 other internships with NOAA before she started with the TCBES program and the Cooperative Fishery Research Unit in 2019. She is a dying breed. She's our last representative from our pre-pandemic time period. So
interesting way.
Yeah, 2019 was our last cohort to not have it, not had to go through the COVID experience as part of the education. And Nikola also has a beautiful 1-year-old daughter who luckily had a babysitter this morning, apparently. So she's not going to be running up and down the thing here distracting Nikola. So that's a good thing. But Nicola's been a pleasure to work with, and she's here to talk about her thesis. Detailing the effects of climate change and fishing pressure on ciguatera prevalence in Hawaiian reef fishes, implications to public health in a changing climate. With that, Nikola, please take it away.
Hi, thank you all so much for joining me today. Intro.
And your committee that I should introduce. I'm sorry.
Not quite finished.
Completely forgot because it's on the back side of my cheat sheet here. Would like to introduce and thank Nicola's committee before she gets started. We have Matt Knope here from Hilo here in the audience. And then online, we're joined by Sarah Fritz from Texas State University and Ingo Koomoa Lang, who is previously from Hilo, our School of Pharmacy, but is now with the Western New England University. And so thank you very much for the committee for participating in this. I completely forgot. I apologize. And now take it away, Nikola. Sorry.
Thank you all so much again for joining me, and I'm gonna go ahead and just start into it. So first, I would like to go ahead and start with thanking the Pacific Island Climate Adaptation Science Center and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Center for facilitating this project. PICAS is jointly funded through Hilo and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and without them, my project would not be possible. I'd also like to give a big mahalo to my family, and especially Nelson, my boyfriend, who's helped me with my project greatly with collecting fishes and just moral support itself and being my cheerleader. I'd also like to thank the committee and my committee, Drs. Tim Grabowski, Matt Knope, Sarah Fritz, Ingo Koomoa Lang. You all have been a great help for me, and I really appreciate all of your patience and understandings and guidance throughout this process. And a big thank you to DAR, the staffing Kona, for helping to facilitate this project as well. They were really key in helping me pick some of my dive sites, and then goodness, pardon me, sorry. I would also like to thank the spearfishing community. They really came through for me for this project. I had a lot of volunteer spearfishers. Everybody was a volunteer except for myself. And Roy are not super easy to collect, so especially in higher pressure areas. So they really had to put some big effort into it for me. So I really appreciate that. And then I also would like to thank Mana Purdy of the Queen Liliuokalani Trust in Kona for allowing us to have access to Hawaiʻi, because that was something that we had to really coordinate with them, and they were open there with no problem. So it was really great. And then thank you to all my lab mates in the Hawaii Cooperative Fishery Unit. They all were really amazing at helping me to process all my data and give me moral support and guidance through some of the OList stuff. We all know how fun that is to polish and age a list. So thank you so much. Oh, and I would also love to give a huge thank you to Drs. Chris Loeffler and his partners over in Germany for processing our samples. They really came through and facilitated that and helped us out amazingly. So we're really excited about these results. Thank you. So I'm just gonna go ahead and jump into some brief history of Ciguatera fish poisoning for those of you who aren't quite as familiar. It was first historically documented in 1521 in the Gulf of Guinea. There was Spanish captains that were affected by Ciguatera poisoning. It related to the death of one of the captains, among other people. Also in 1786, Captain Cook, his crew was taken sick by Ciguatera fish poisoning, and that was documented by the ship surgeon. Ciguatera fish poisoning is considered one of the most common marine-related toxins in the tropics and subtropics. It's really prevalent in the Pacific Islands, Indian Ocean, and as well as the Caribbean. Ciguatera has become a worldwide problem and has been largely neglected globally. Due to the globalization and increased fish and seafood exports, we're seeing cases being reported in non-tropical regions such as Germany, where our people who are doing our testing samples. So Ciguatera fish poisoning is caused by the consumption of reef fishes that contain ciguatoxin produced by dinoflagellates in the genus Gambierdiscus and Hilo. Ciguatoxin is heat stable, it has no odor, it has no color, it cannot be made safe by any means of cooking, freezing, or food preservation. While rarely fatal, Ciguatera fish poisoning has been characterized with gastrointestinal, cardiovascular, and neurological symptoms, which range from mild and short-term to long-term debilitating. Some of the more common symptoms are the reversal of hot and cold, diarrhea, vomiting, pins and needles. Those are just to name a few. There's been over 175 documented symptoms with Ciguatera fish poisoning. And it's been thought that only about 20% of the cases are actually documented and reported, and a lot of the cases may be misdiagnosed due to flu-like symptoms such as nausea, diarrhea, and fevers. And so there may be misdiagnosed for just a flu rather than what they actually were eating. The US Food and Drug Administration and the European Food Safety Authority have proposed a fish toxicity concentration of 0.01 micrograms of ciguatoxin per kilogram of fish tissue. This is being a level which is unlikely to invoke Ciguatera symptoms. So these are some of the common reef fishes that people are more familiar with that are implemented in Ciguatera fish poisoning. So we have the Roy, the Kole, Omilu, Ulua. We have our snappers, barracudas, wahanui, parrotfish, moray eels. However, these fishes just bioaccumulate this naturally in their environment, and it's through the food chain. But there have been over 400 different fish that have been involved in Ciguatera fish poisoning. So these are just very many amount of fish. This infogram is just to kind of give a brief overview of how it enters the food chain. So it starts off with smaller herbivorous fish eating the limu or the algae, and the dinoflagellates live on the algae. The toxin bioaccumulates into their flesh and in their organs, and then the bigger fish eat that. It bioaccumulates in the larger fish and then biomagnifies as well. And then later on, we go fishing, we catch the fish, we eat it, we ingest it, and we also start to bioaccumulate and get the toxins in our bodies. So the effects of Ciguatera fish poisoning are multifaceted and have extensive economic and ecological impacts. Hawaiian reefs produce around 7 million meals per year. This makes Ciguatera fish poisoning a food security issue and an economic issue. Hawaii had a Ciguatera scare in the 80s, which involved the lua, and this led to the 90% decline of that commercial fishery. And today, that fishery has never recovered. Furthermore, the fear of contracting Ciguatera is the main reason behind the nearshore fishery of the Peacock Grouper has never taken off, because everyone's scared to shoot it because they're going to get sick. This image here just signifies that Alua is still an issue in 2018. So people, they still fish for it just recreationally, but it is still causing a large amount of cases of Ciguatera. Due to the economic and ecological impact Ciguatera poisoning has on communities, preventive measures have been developed at more broad ranges and local levels to protect the public from being sick. At a local level, there has been rapid test kits such as the Ciguatera test kit here, which you could use to test your fish and see if it was positive for Ciguatera within a few hours. However, that's no longer available due to the false negatives. People were getting sick after they thought the fishes were okay. And then, of course, we have the personal tactics that locals have seen for generations, to help mitigate their ways of contacting ciguatera poisoning. Some of these tactics are to avoid the largest predators, don't eat fish from specific areas. They'll test it with a cat first, or they just won't eat the head or belly because they think that that's where you get sick from. At a broader scale, there's been numerous publications that have studied a range of biological and environmental factors that may influence ciguatera prevalence. It's been found that wave energy affects the prevalence of ciguatera and roy. It's been found that the size of fish affects whether the fish will be caught or not. Sea surface temperature has been related to affect the prevalence of ciguatera poisoning. Sea surface temperature has also been related to the increased abundance and toxicity of Gambierdiscus. And other anthropogenic factors such as effluent can also affect the prevalence of ciguatera poisoning in areas. However, there has been no studies that look at fish-specific factors and their relationship to ciguatera at a fish's home range level. And that's what we were seeking to do. So as we saw earlier, herbivore fishes are known links of ciguatera into the food web. And they feed on the algae, and the Gambierdiscus live on the algae. But a field study in the US Virgin Islands was done to see how reducing grazing rates affect Gambierdiscus abundance. And it was found that Gambierdiscus communities increased by 138% on average when grazers larger than 1.7 centimeters were limited from the control area. So this infers that the aerial density of Gambierdiscus is affected by changes in herbivorous fishes' feeding habits, grazing rates, and selectivity. Increased availability of macroalgae creates larger availability for Gambierdiscus to adhere to and grow more suitable subjects. But in contrast, decreased herbivore abundance also decreases the amount of ciguatera links that we have to enter. So climate change has been found to affect the prevalence of ciguatera on our reefs. Bleaching events provide fresh habitat for algae to colonize, in turn providing new habitat for Gambierdiscus. However, sea surface temperature is not the only thing changing with global warming. We're having increased sea level rise, storm events, increased precipitation, increased nutrient inputs. All of these changes also happen to affect the habitat composition and community shifts in our marine systems. We need to better understand how climate change interacts with anthropogenic and environmental drivers to influence the prevalence of ciguatera. So this will help us learn how to adapt to the changes in our marine ecosystems and develop management strategies to protect our public. By understanding climate change's interaction with ciguatera poisoning, we'll better understand if these strategies used by the local fishers to mitigate their risk will be adaptive under climate change. So this brings me to my objectives. I assess how the various environmental factors affect the prevalence and toxicity of ciguatera and roy along the west coast of Hawaii. And then I also assess the perceived risk of ciguatera fish poisoning and the local fishing community to the actual risk. My study took place on the west coast of Hawaiʻi Island. My study sites were chosen based on percent coral cover and herbivore biomass, and that information was provided by the Division of Aquatic Resources in Kona. I wanted to have sites with a broader range of herbivore biomass and percent coral cover. My study focused on the Peacock Grouper, locally known as roy. Roy was selected because it is an introduced high trophic level predator, and it is not taken for subsistence use because people are scared of ciguatera fish poisoning. So all my samples were collected by volunteer spearfishers or myself using a 3-pounder spear gun along the coastline of all my collection sites. I recorded the location of each fish with using a handheld GPS that was attached to our dive float, or people were using their personal dive watches. Each fish was tagged with a zip tie that had the site and weigh number on it, and then The samples were put on ice as soon as we got out of the water. Once we got back to Hilo, we either processed the samples or we would freeze them. And then we recorded the total length of the fish when we were processing, and that was so that we could use it as a variable because it was previously shown to influence organic back positive for Ciguatera. The sample fish were either frozen or are fresh or previously frozen when the tissue samples were removed. I collected 2 samples ranging between 5 and 20 grams. And then made sure the samples didn't have a bone or skin. And then all the samples were washed and dried, and then I dehydrated them. So we dehydrated them at 74 degrees for 6 hours. Each sample was labeled and vacuum sealed in individual plastic bags. And then we shipped that off to the Federal Institute of Risk Assessment in Berlin, Germany, along with a little care package of MacNuts, coffee, and some Big Island cookies. That say a big mahalo to them because they really pulled through for us. So thank you again. And this is a general workflow of how they were testing our fish. So this is a novel 2-tier method that was developed by Drs. Loeffler and Astrid Spillmeyer for testing the fish samples for Ciguatera. So first they took the dehydrated tissue and made a dry tissue extract. The toxicity of that extract was tested through N2-assay method, which is using rat synopsis. Samples with Ciguatera detected were then 2-tiered tested by the LCMS method. And that is considered the gold standard for testing Ciguatera. So it was really nice to have it double checked. So, and then extracts that were examined for Ciguatera under these 2 standards, the CPX1 and the C2X1B. So all the samples were tested against the standard. And this is just some figures that they had sent me so that I could kind of understand what it would look like when they were testing against the standard. So in the top left is the standard. And you see the curve, and then that's one of my fish samples, the positive. So the positive, negative, and trace, these are all of my samples. So the positive, you can see that it looks very similar to the standard. The negative, you can see it's pure negative, but the trace, those ones, they would go back and clean up the sample a little bit more and retest it to see if they could come with a positive or a negative. And if not, it was left as a. And so I wanted to see if I could use age of the fish to predict the prevalence and toxicity of Ciguatera in fish samples. So I extracted and prepared the otoliths from 88 Roy. The right or left sagittae was randomly selected and embedded into epoxy. I cut 25 millimeter transverse sections with the nucleus, and then we using a isomat low speed precision cutter fitted with diamond wafering blades. Those were then mounted onto glass slides using crystal bond thermoplastic mounting adhesive and wet polished with increasingly fine grit so that we could get the nucleus exposed, and each fish was aged by 2 individual agers. If there was any discrepancy between age, a third reader would come in, and if they couldn't come to a consensus, that was tossed out. To characterize the habitat of Roy samples at a home range specific to Roy, I assembled a suite of site and fish specific habitat characteristics describing conditions within a 40 meter radius circle around the collection site. So each fish's individual collection site. I estimated the long-term wave power using an output from a 500 meter simulated wave nearshore model based on wave power data that was collected between 1979 and 2013. I considered wave power because it has been identified as a factor that affects the prevalence of Ciguatera in Roy here on the Hawaiʻi Islands. Total effluent was estimated using on-site sewage disposal systems such as cesspools and septic tanks. And this data was collected from the University of Hawaii and the State Department of Hawaii. I considered effluent because it has also been found to affect the prevalence of Ciguatera poisoning in Florida. And I wanted to see if effluent could have an effect on the prevalence and toxicity of Ciguatera here in Roy at a home range level. It has been found that sea surface temperature creates shifts in marine fish populations, which can affect fish size distributions and life cycles, this increasing fishery pressure on already exploited areas. I wanted to see if fishing pressure would have any effects on the prevalence and toxicity of Roy at a whole range level. For the models, the mean total annual catch of reef fish was estimated from commercial data and non-commercial data, and it was collected by DAR during 2003 to 2013. The non-commercial data was collected by phone and intercept surveys as a part of the Marine Recreational Information Program during 2004 and 2013. This data was taken from the Ocean Tipping Points Hawaii case study and is represented as fishing pressure on models. Sea surface temperature affects the prevalence of, and the toxicity of Ciguatera and Roy. I wanted to see if it does, at the home range level. So I used the NOAA Coral Reef Watch data. These are temperatures that are used to assess coral bleaching alerts based on degree heat weeks and sea surface temperature anomalies. I summed the days that each individual fish experienced a coral bleaching of a warning or higher over the last 3 years. And this was taken from the NOAA Coral Reef Watch and represented by BAA3 on my models. I used the SOAS 5-meter bathymetry synthesis grid to estimate the mean depth at a 40-meter home range, habitat circle centered on the fish captors point, using this interesting bathymetry data from the main Hawaiian Islands from the SOAS final technical report, and it's represented as percent substrate composition of the home range circles centered on the capture locations was estimated using the Highmark data. Substrate composition data layers, they were synthesized from the NOAA's National Center for Coastal Ocean Science 2007 benthic habitat maps, and as well as the Global Airborne Observatory data, which had the estimates for sand cover, so they would kind of overlap them to fill in any gaps, and that was taken from 2019. Highmark data assigns 100-meter square grids from the shoreline to 30-meter contour. And the substrate classes that I used were coral, boulder, hard bottom, and soft bottom for my models. So I wanted to see if herbivore abundance and percent coral cover had an effect on the toxicity level and prevalence of Ciguatera in Roy's. It's been previously shown that Gambierdiscus abundance affects the amount and available substrate, and herbivore grazing affects the abundance of Gambierdiscus. So the current mean percent coral cover and mean herbivore biomass for each collection area was provided by DAR at Kona side, and we used their WAP surveys, which were fixed transect surveys introduced for the management areas that focus on the commercial fishery aquarium. The benthic cover data was from permanent monitoring sites and was analyzed using benthic imagery analysis of the belt transects, and that was represented as mean coral and herbivore biomass. So I wanted to identify variables that were specific to each site, and I wanted to see if there was any variables at a home range of the sampled fish that differed across sites. I also wanted to make sure that the mean length of Roy were homogeneous across sites, and make sure that we didn't have any previously large Roy in one site and really small Roy in another site. I did this to evaluate the mean length and age of sampled fishes to see if they varied across selection sites using an ANOVA, and I assessed the degree in which variables within the 40-meter radius circles varied using AMANOVA. Pairwise differences were assessed using the post hoc test with the Bonferroni adjustment for multiple pairs. So to test the anthropogenic drivers and current understanding of Ciguatera, I developed an inquiry candidate set of 24 models using different combinations of standardized environmental and fish-specific variables to predict the probability of the fish samples testing positive for Ciguatera. The same candidate set of models was used to test the toxicity levels of the fish samples as well. So because the dependent variables in the toxicity are concentration of Ciguatera, this was a continuous and zero inflated data set. So I had to use a generalized linear model with a Tweety distribution. And this is not the Tweety bird that we're talking about here. It's a new type of distribution, and it's a non-negative distribution that is suited for data with a mixture of zeros and positive values. It's similar to the distribution, but for continuous data. So I use an AIC model selection. With the AIC models, it quantifies the trade-off between model fit and complexity, with lower AIC models meaning a better model fit. So I calculated the AIC model, AIC for small sample size, the delta AIC and the model weight. The models with the delta AIC of 2.0 or less were considered to be comparable to the top models. And if there were evidence supporting of more than one top model, I would perform a model average of the entire candidate model set to see if any other variables are playing, have any effect on the models. So for my results, I found that Ciguatera is present along the whole coast of Hawaiʻi Island. I had a positivity rate of about 25% for all of my sites with the exception of Pu'uko. Pu'uko was slightly higher at 35%. And this was not surprising because there is literature that says that Pu'uko is considered a hotspot. I assessed the total length and found that the total length of all the roys was similar across sites. I assessed the age across sites. I found that they were all very similar across sites. When I looked at the mean depth, I found that the mean depth at Halipa'o and KA were similar to, and then the mean depths at Anaya Ho'omalu Bay and Pu'uko were similar, with Pu'uko and Anaya Ho'omalu Bay being shallower. And that's represented by the blue and green. I analyzed whether there was a mean difference in wave power, and I found a difference across all sites, which was represented by the different colored dots next to every site. I analyzed if the fishing pressure was similar across sites, and I found that it was similar between Anaya Ho'omalu Bay and Halipa'o. However, it was different between Pu'uko and KA, which is represented by the blue and red and green. The effluent was higher at KA and lower at Anaya Ho'omalu Bay, but it was similar between Anaya Ho'omalu Bay and Halipa'o. And then when I got into my results of my models, I found that larger roy exposed to fewer bleaching days in the past 3 years and in areas with lower fishing pressure are more likely to test positive for Ciguatera than smaller individuals who experience more bleaching days and that are in areas of higher fishing pressure. So these figures have the average mean total length Ciguatera bleaching days in the past 3 years and mean annual catch. And then it has the probability of Ciguatera positive, which is 0 to 1. With the total length increases, the probability of the fish coming back positive increases. As the coral bleaching days increase, the probability of ciguatoxin decreases. And that same trend goes for the fishing pressure, which is the mean annual catch. And so the probability decreases as the mean total annual catch increases. So due to the model variability, I calculated the average mean in this one. There is more than one top model. And I found that decreased boulder cover also had an effect, as well as decreased levels may increase the probability of positive for safety. So when I analyzed the toxicity levels of roy, I found similar results. I found that larger roy exposed to less bleaching days in the past 3 days had a higher were coming back more toxic. And so had higher toxic levels, and smaller roy that experienced more bleaching days. So these figures again are the average mean values for the total length and coral bleaching days in the past 3 years. And you can see that as the total length increases, the toxicity increases. For the coral bleaching alert days, as the number of days increase, the toxicity level decreases. There was only one top model for this one, so I did not have to do a model averaging, thankfully. So this was the human dimension aspect of my project, and it was more of like a talk story with the volunteer spearfishers that I got to interact with, and with the people, divers, and other local fishers who I met that were interested in my project. And I was able to make really nice connections with a lot of different people and get to know people's perspective of Ciguatera in our community. And I was interested in three things. I wanted to know, where did they learn about Ciguatera fish poisoning? What did they do to prevent themselves from getting sick? And what did they think increased their risk of getting sick? So I was able to talk to about 27 individuals. And when I was talking to them, the question about perceived risk of Ciguatera fish poisoning obviously was the topic. And in our conversations, I learned that majority of people found out about Ciguatera from their family, because, you know, everybody learns how to fish from their dad, you know, or their mom, or, you know, so it's typically passed down generationally. 33% said their family, 17% said that they helped out with studies. And so that's how they actually found out, which was pretty cool. So a lot of these local spearfishers, you know, they're getting recruited like I was recruiting, you know. So nice here in Hawaii that, you know, there has been many studies, and so that's how they found out about it. 16% say friends, you know, because they're diving with them. Another 14% said internet, and about 8% of them said magazines or school or any other topics. And then when I asked the fishers what factors did they think increase their risk of contracting Ciguatera fish poisoning, location was the biggest one. There was a wide range of answers, but 30% of the people believe that location was the most driving factor of where you're getting a Ciguatera. So these locations are more populated areas, so like next to golf courses, resorts, you know, really more developed areas. So they're thinking, you know, the runoffs and all of that too are affecting what they're saying. They also don't target species like koi or lua. So a lot of people are more choosy on what they like to eat. And then other factors that stood out were the amount of fish that they eat. They talked about the environment, so more of like areas that were like they think dirty water or bleached out and stuff like that, you know. And then the head and the belly not eating those. So when I talked to fishers about how they prevent from getting Ciguatera fish poisoning, most of them had the same answer. There was a few unique answers, but 28% of them said they just chance it because, you know, as a diver myself, I've definitely been guilty of chancing it for some, you know, bigger fish. And it's their refrigerator, so they're still going to eat fish. They're still going to dive. You know, if they got a big uku, we know uku sometimes has sig, but they're like, it's a prize fish. They're going to eat it. 13% said they only eat fish from specific locations. They try to eat fish in moderation, obviously selective on fishes that are thought to be high risk. So in conclusion, there is a lot of variability in anthropogenic factors. I found that size matters when predicting the prevalence and toxicity of the roi. In my study, at a more of a home range level. Larger roi are more likely to test positive for Ciguatera fish poisoning and have higher toxicity levels when evaluated at a home range for roi. So this is something that has been new because more studies have looked at a broader range. So we looked at where the fish was actually collected from each individual. So that was really nice. This finding was consistent with previous studies. So previous studies have shown that larger fish are more prevalent for Ciguatera, which is good. And this was also consistent with local fishers' perceived risk of Ciguatera fish poisoning. You know, a lot of them assume that the larger fish will come back to Ciguatera as well. So it was interesting to see. So fishing pressure, I found that fishing pressure increased the ciguatera prevalence at a home range level, but it was decreased fishing pressure. So this was not consistent with previous studies. However, it is interesting to affect how it affects the prevalence and toxicity of roy at a home range level because of these studies that have found decreased herbivore abundance and grazing rates affects the Gambierdiscus populations. So in theory, increased fishing pressure would increase the prevalence of ciguatoxin and the toxicity of ciguatoxins in roy. However, this is the opposite of what we found at a home range level. So when I spoke to local fishers, they believe that the risk of ciguatera increases in locations with more developed areas. So again, this is not in par with what they think either. So you would assume that overdeveloped areas that have higher fishing pressure, because more people in the water, would have higher prevalence. So it's also one of those things where you're like, okay, where is this kind of going? But this result is interesting because when you think about management strategies, so you have these areas that have decreased fishing pressure and they have a high prevalence of ciguatera. So we have marine protected areas that are, potentially being resistant. And so do we need to consider what the risk value of these areas are before we open them so that we can create mitigation plans to protect ourselves before we open them? Also, on the other hand, if people believe that these protected areas have high ciguatera, maybe we'll get less poachers. You won't have people going in there and wanting to go and collect fish. So it can deter that, but it also means that areas with higher fishing pressure will have less fish, which is less links for ciguatera to go up into the food chain, but it also creates more habitat for Gambierdiscus. So in those areas where there is increased fishing pressure. But so yeah, we are looking at another fish fully. So hopefully this will help to clarify some of these findings here. So when I started the project, I was planning to use coral bleaching data. That wasn't possible, so I turned to this bleaching alert data from NOAA. Bleaching alert data I used was a measure of coral bleaching, wasn't a measure of coral bleaching, sorry, it was a measure of sea surface temperature and the days that it was at a warning level or at a higher level. So when I analyzed how many days the roy experienced a bleaching alert warning or higher level at its home range, I found that roy who experienced less bleaching days were more likely to test positive for ciguatera or be more toxic. So I found this interesting because the study done in the US Virgin Islands, it looked at sea surface temperature and Gambierdiscus and abundance and Gambierdiscus and toxicity of Gambierdiscus. And so when a roy experiences less bleaching days, it could potentially be sitting at an optimal temperature range for Gambierdiscus. And so it was found that Gambierdiscus toxicity increases in the cooler months. So it has a temperature threshold of between 26 and 28 degrees Celsius to where their toxicity levels increase. So this was really interesting because you can have these bleaching events where the temperature is getting warm and it's optimal for Gambierdiscus to grow. And so that's between 26 and 31 degrees Celsius. So that's optimal growth rate where the Gambierdiscus can just percolate over the reef. And then once it cools down, the Gambierdiscus is now at an optimal rate for the toxicity to peak. So you have these areas that these fish are sitting in and they're just eating all this toxins and it's super, super toxic during the cooler times of the year. So this might explain why the toxicity level was increased with fewer bleaching days in the past 3 years because they're sitting there at optimal temperature for them. On the other hand, when sea surface temperature is higher and the number of bleaching days are increased, there are potential temperature, or it's the potential for them to grow and But then if it reaches over 34 degrees Celsius, the Gambierdiscus can't survive. So it does have that temperature threshold on the higher end as well. So it's one of those balances where I guess if we were to monitor what the sea surface temperature is doing, we might be able to infer like what our Gambierdiscus communities are kind of looking like on the coast, because we know it's there, especially here in Hawaii. Like we see we have positive fish up and down the coast, right? It may not be 50% or whatever, but 25% is still 25%. It's 1 in 4 fish, right? So if we are getting these bleaching days and it doesn't hit above a specific threshold, then we can assume, okay, these Gambierdiscus populations may be increasing, you know, and then when it cools down into the winter months, these populations are becoming really toxic. So maybe these are times of the year that people should be warned about the increased probability of ciguatera poisoning. For me, that's something I consider as a diver because, you know, these are the things that I just learned as well. So it's like, okay, so are these things that I'm going to try implementing later on. So this factor, this factor was not consistent with local fisheries either. They didn't consider. Everybody considers like bleaching areas as high risk for ciguatera. So like everybody else, it was kind of like the reverse of what we were initially thinking. So again, we're hoping that the Foley will help us clarify some of the answers. So should we continue just to chance it? None of the factors that the fishers identified were were found in my study other than the total length. So the environmental factors, none of them like were on par with their perceived risk. So we need to find out ways to kind of reach out to our communities to educate them about factors that do influence ciguatera poisoning, because people are learning from their family and friends first, right? And so we need ways to make sure that they have current up-to-date information about what's going on with our changing climates, because we all need to learn how to adapt, right? And the climate's changing so fast that it's hard to adapt. And so it's like, what are these mitigation tactics that we're going to be using? How can this type of data influence strategies to educate or have top stories with community members, with fishers like me, you know, and my family, to be like, hey, okay, there's a huge bleaching event. Maybe we're not going to eat fish for a while because, you know, the prevalence rate might be like super high, you know. So, and then we can maybe develop different monitoring sites, monitoring ways of monitoring the Gambierdiscus communities. There are certain strategies that have been developed for management agencies to be able to go and put plaques out, you know, and see what the community looks like. So maybe these are all things that we can learn to do and slowly start adapting to and implementing in the future as our climates continue to change at the rate that they're changing. So, and with that, I'll say thank you. And if you all have any questions, please feel free to ask.
So I'm going to take over sort of moderating duties here. I think we'll focus on questions. Okay. So for those of you here, just raise your hand, and those of you online, there should be a gesture button you can push, and I will make sure to call on you so that you can ask your questions to Nikola. I think we have the volume turned up, and so we should be good to go.
Any questions? Yes, Rich.
So the ciguatera associated with bleaching days, you think that the algae, eating more algae is more available, but it has to do with the temperature being above the ideal
So with
the algae to do it.
So the question is, if the amount of bleaching days affects the temperature threshold for the Gambierdiscus?
Yeah.
Yes. So what I believe just with the past studies that have been found with the toxicity levels is that with the fish experiencing a lower amount of bleaching days, is that temperature is at more of an optimal level for the toxicity to peak. So if it's a hotter temperature, then it's the Gambierdiscus is growing, but it's not necessarily as toxic. So it's out there and it's becoming more and more. But once the temperature decreases, the toxicity level increases. So that's why we're seeing more hot fish during those cooler times of the year. Any other questions?
I have a quick one. So since I've been, engaged with this study somewhat, I know that you mentioned the collate data is still pending, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so you did twice the work than what you described, because you've also talked about research on collate. Do you have any data from the collate, and does it seem to be following the same trends, or?
We do have some of the positivity rates back. And but it's only for one site, one in a partial site, so it's hard to see the trends, but
Yeah.
we do have some positive fishes, definitely,
Yeah.
in the collate, and it kind of seems like it's a little bit higher positivity rate. So,
Interesting.
yeah, but we don't know, like, we haven't gotten the toxicity levels necessarily back to analyze that either. So.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, but they're working diligently on it, and
Yeah.
they're like, it's not a quick process, so
No.
it's like, I think 5 samples in a week maybe they can do, and they're a total setup lab that, has been doing it forever. I saw my trouble trying to do it here, just doing the extraction, so it was yeah, it's a very complex method, so they're working really hard, and they're not used to working with 200 samples either. So usually, they're getting fish samples that are sent in from, a Ciguatera poisoning case in Germany that they're like, hey, identify this fish because it was a mislabeled fish. So that's something they're having a problem with in Germany is mislabeled fish coming through. And so people are getting sick and it's becoming this like health scare, from fish they're buying in the grocery store.
So we have a question online from Jeff Burgett. Jeff?
Yeah, hey, Nikola, thanks for the show. That was really well done. A question again, kind of like Karen's about the bleaching link or sea surface temperature link. So you used your variable was the sea surface temperatures for the previous 3 years, correct?
Correct.
The bleaching thing. So that actually would have integrated any of these, temperature spikes and, a lot of Gambierdiscus growth, and then temperature goes down and they get more toxic. So that would have kind of been all smooshed together in this. So I'm just wondering how you can make any, is it a bit of a stretch to talk about the, trying to time your consumption or catching of a potentially toxic fish based on that? It just seems like the fish is actually integrating all of that cycles together, and so I'm not sure how relevant the various phases of the dinoflagellate toxicity cycle really work with that. Can you kind of tease that out for me? How are you thinking about that?
Sure. So the question is, how do we kind of disentangle the bleaching days that each fish experiences individually at a home range level? Well, as if we were talking about the fish, so fish bioaccumulate the toxin, right? And we don't necessarily know how quickly the fish metabolize these toxins either. And so it has been found that the toxins are stored in the liver and then it's metabolized and then stored into the flesh. So there's so much variability in this that you can't really say for sure, but in possibility, these Gambierdiscus could be experiencing peaks, and so the fish are eating it during these peaks over the time, and then it's still in their body. But it's one of those things where it's hard to say, but when it's just more of a temperature threshold is kind of what my perspective is, because if they're not experiencing days at a higher temperature, So these fish, it was individual for each fish per their age, right? So it was only suitable for fish that were at least 3 years or older. And so during that lifespan, if that fish in that area, because it wasn't one consistent number either, there was multiple numbers for each site. So for each individual fish. So if that individual fish would experience less bleaching days than say the fish in Puako, then it would have higher toxicity than the fish in Puako. Does that make sense?
He's asking. So you have a 3-year data series. That potentially could have 3 of these cycles that you're talking about
Mhm.
fishing on,
Mhm.
but it's integrated across the 3. So how do you know they fish during
He's talking about BAA,
the
right?
high temperature?
Yeah.
That you're not getting a fish that's already experienced like the previous 2 years of those cycles.
Oh, well, you don't. Yeah, but it's just one of those things where it's. Yeah, it still needs to the site be, I guess. Dug into a little bit more.
So I
Does that question right there, Jeff? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. It's obviously, because of the variability between fish that, it's difficult to say, but I didn't know if do you know, actually, is the toxin actually metabolized and eliminated, or is it just is it a stream?
I-
Does it just accumulate, but it never goes away?
No, it excretes, it does over time, but every fish I'm assuming is different humans. We all metabolize at different rates, and I don't know if I haven't come across any studies that show the metabolizing rates of individual fish species, so, it's hard to say.
Okay, well, thank you.